Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back through the centuries, not into soft flannel or silk but into something far stranger, a time when people mostly didn't wear anything at all to bed. You're lying there, on a scratchy straw mattress, in a room with stone walls and no heating. You're bone tired after a day spent hauling firewood, plowing fields, or maybe dodging taxes. So what do you change into for bed? Well, nothing. That's right. Most medieval people just slept naked. No fuzzy pajama pants, no oversized shirts with ironic slogans, and certainly no fluffy robes. You probably won't survive this not because of sword fights or plagues but because the concept of nightwear as we know it simply didn't exist for most of human history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a medieval home now, maybe a thatched hut in the English countryside or a cramped urban dwelling tucked beside a marketplace. There's no bathroom to freshen up in, and no wardrobe brimming with options. You've spent the whole day in the same linen shirt or wool tunic, and you might sleep in it if it's cold. But more often than not, you just strip down. Sleeping in the nud wasn't scandalous. In fact, it was practical. Clothes were expensive, not easily washable, and often bulky or itchy. Most folks had one or two garments at best. Why ruin them with nighttime sweat and twisted tossing? But here's where things get interesting. While nudity in the bedroom was common among peasants and laborers, upper-class folks had choices and rules. Wealthier people sometimes had bedclothes but not the cozy fleece onesie you're picturing. Think loose lion shirts or night smocks. Think layers when appropriate. But even then, people often preferred to air out their bodies overnight. Some clergy wrote moral warnings about sleeping naked, particularly for women. The body, after all, was the site of temptation. But for most medieval folks, sleeping in your skin wasn't sinful, it was economical and sensible. Your bedmate might be your spouse or a sibling or a farm-hand. In a one-room household, privacy was a myth. Everyone sought each other in various states of undress. But this wasn't a society that obsessed over gym bodies and bedroom aesthetics. This was a society that obsessed over surviving until morning. Now, you might be wondering, what about blankets? Surely people didn't just sleep exposed. And yes, they did cover themselves. Thick wool blankets, fur throws, or even straw mats might shield you from the bitter night air. But there was no snug fleece bird or wrap situation. If you were lucky, your blanket didn't crawl away with bedbugs. Interestingly, some records suggest people kept knives or small weapons near their beds not because of monsters, but thieves. You slept naked, but you didn't sleep unarmed. It paints a weird picture, doesn't it? A stark naked man jumping up to fend off intruders with a dagger in hand. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or anecdotal oddity. There's one account from a 13th century English court where a man was attacked in bed and testified that he had no time to fetch his shirt. The court found this believable because again, people didn't wear shirts to sleep. Medieval judges, apparently, knew what was up. Even royalty got comfy in their own way. King Henry I of England is recorded as sleeping in a simple lion shirt, not jeweled robes or elaborate dressing gowns. And this wasn't due to humility, it was just the norm. Pajamas weren't a royal indulgence. They weren't even a thing. But the real kicker. In some cultures, nightwear was considered suspicious. If you had a special bed outfit, it might suggest vanity. Why would you need something fancy to sleep in, unless you were expecting company? The Middle Ages were nothing if not judgmental in strange ways. So you lie there in the medieval dark, under a scratchy blanket, with no underwear, no socks, and definitely no heated mattress pad. Just you, the cool air, and the sounds of mice in the corner. And somehow, people slept. You wake up still naked, still tangled in that same scratchy blanket, and you realize something odd. You didn't actually change out of your clothes last night because, well, you never wore pajamas to begin with. But let's say it's a colder evening now. You're not feeling brave. You shuffle over to your one and only shirt, the same one you've worn all day, and you just keep it on. In the Middle Ages, most people owned exactly one shirt. Maybe two, if they were fortunate or very careful. These weren't your stretchy, breathable modern cotton tees either. No, they were often made from homespun linen, roughly sewn, and absolutely not washed after every wear. Or every week. Or, if we're being honest, even every month. It was the shirt you farmed in, ate in, argued in, prayed in, and yes, sometimes slept in too. The idea of changing into something more comfortable simply didn't exist. And even when people did sleep in a garment, it wasn't for sleeping, it was just what they already had on, or whatever was dry enough to tolerate. There's a rather charming but also mildly horrifying habit described in several monastic communities. The sleep shirt was not separate from the work shirt. Monks might rise for midnight prayers wearing the same robe they went to sleep in, which, in turn, was the same robe they did chores in, and the same robe they'd be buried in if things took a turn. It was the robe. Singular. And the thing is, no one really minded. In fact, There's a kind of anti-luxury philosophy behind all this. Comfort wasn't just rare, it was suspect. The church often encouraged simplicity and suffering as virtues. If your clothes were soft and your bed was warm, maybe you were getting a bit too cozy with earthly pleasures. Historians still debate how widely this mindset extended beyond religious circles. Did lay people really avoid comfort for moral reasons? Or was it just a matter of limited resources? Probably both. But one thing's clear, pajamas as a concept didn't stand a chance. This brings us to one particularly weird social detail. In wealthier households, servants were expected to help their masters dress and undress. But because many nobles slept naked, the act of disrobing in front of others wasn't especially shocking. Modesty was relative. What mattered more was the hierarchy who had the right to see whom unclothed. If a nobleman stripped down in front of his valet, that was routine. But if the valet got naked in the wrong company, that could be scandalous. Another fringe bit of fashion lore, in some courtly households, a nightshirt might be passed down as an heirloom. Not because it was cozy, but because it was embroidered with a family crest or stitched in a way that symbolized a particular lineage. Imagine inheriting your great-great-grandfather's stained linen tunic and feeling honored. And then there's the laundry problem. Washing clothes was hard, physical labor. It involved boiling, scrubbing, wringing, and drying without detergent or machines. So most folks just didn't wash very often. Which means if you had 2 shirts, you'd rotate between almost clean and not quite crunchy. If you had only one, it just accumulated. Some women reportedly slept in their chemises thin undergarments made of linen that doubled as both underwear and nightwear. Men might sleep in long shirts or go commando under the covers. Either way, the clothes weren't designed for sleep. They were just the least worst option available. And in summer, back to full nudity. Unless you were in a monastery, in which case you might be expected to never remove your habit even in bed. There are chilling reports of monks being buried in the same robes they slept and worked in, stiff with years of devotion and body oil. What's most bizarre is how normal all of this was to them. There were no cotton drawstring pants with cartoons. No cute flannel sets for Christmas morning selfies. No TikToks of get ready for bed with me featuring skincare routines and matching sleepwear. You had a shirt or you didn't. And that was that. But even in this austere reality, some people tried to inject comfort into the mix. A few medieval texts mention stuffing clothes with herbs like lavender or mint, hoping to mask the fun. One diary from the 14th century notes a traveler who hung his shirt by the window to let the night winds freshen it. He didn't wash it, just aired it out. Points for effort. So tonight, as you slip into your 10-piece sleep ensemble and climb into your memory foam cocoon, give a quiet nod to the medieval peasant who slept in his crusty shirt and called it a good night. Tonight, you're in for a treat, if by treat you mean rolling around on a medieval mattress in your one crumpled shirt, trying not to itch. Let's talk about fabric, because even if people didn't change into proper pajamas, they still had to sleep on something. And usually, that something involved linen if you were lucky. Otherwise, things got a bit rougher. Literally. Linen was the dream fabric of the time, soft, breathable, and relatively hygienic, thanks to its ability to be washed more easily than wool. But linen didn't come cheap. Producing it required a lengthy process of retting, breaking, scutching, hackling, spinning, and weaving. By the time it became a usable sheet or shirt, it had traveled through more human hands than your Amazon package ever will. So, owning linen was a mark of relative comfort or even status. If you were poor though, you likely didn't wrap yourself in fine linen. You might have tried to sleep in coarse wool, sometimes dyed, often not, and very rarely linen. Imagine trying to relax wrapped in something that felt like a potato sack married a cactus. Not exactly your Satan pillowcase vibes. And speaking of pillows, those weren't exactly guaranteed either. Some folks slept on straw-filled sacks. Others had their heads elevated by rolled-up cloaks, a spare bundle of firewood, or nothing at all. The concept of comfort was deeply relative. What would keep you up at night might felt downright luxurious to someone from the 13th century. Now, here's a lovely detail for your bedtime thoughts: lice. Not bed bugs, though they were around too, but lice. The seams of clothing were warm, dark, and just moist enough to be perfect breeding grounds for them. There are documented accounts of medieval people literally keeping a seam combed by their beds, not for styling, but to scrape the insects out of their shirt seams before sleep. Some even joked about it in literature. A medieval French poem likens fleas to nightly dance partners and lice to bedside musicians. Honestly, if you've ever had a mosquito in your room at 3 you're closer to medieval experience than you might want to be. Historians still debate whether lice and fleas were just accepted parts of life or actively fought against. Some argue that wealthier folks made real efforts at cleanliness, while others insist that everyone was more or less resigned to being itchy. But even if you did have clean-ish linen, it wasn't always comfortable. Coarse linen unbleached and untreated could be stiff and scratchy, especially when new. It softened with age, but until then, it was a bit like wearing a napkin made from tree bark. Now, let's peek into a noble household. You walk into a chamber with a 4-poster bed, rich hangings, and maybe even a feather mattress. The lady of the house has a servant who helps her undress, loosening laces, removing layers of wool and silk, maybe sliding her into a night shift made of fine bleached linen. She might even have perfumed sachets in her bed to mask the smell of, well, people. And still, she is probably scratching at the seams. Even for royalty, the idea of luxury sleepwear was still in its awkward infancy. Nightgowns weren't fashion statements, they were practical garments, thin, loose-fitting, designed to be easy to wash and less valuable if they got ruined in the night. And for the working class, if you had a blanket that wasn't shared by 5 people, you were doing alright. A coarse sheet, a wool cover, and the family dog curled at your feet if you were lucky enough to have one made up the average medieval slumber setup. Let's not forget chamber pots, either. No midnight strolls to the bathroom in a fuzzy robe and bunny slippers. If you had to go, you'd better hope the pot wasn't already full or worse, missing. Oh, and here's a weird one. There are records of people stuffing bits of fabric under their armpits or between their legs at night, not for comfort, but to soak up sweat and avoid ruining the one shirt they own. This was the closest thing they had to night hygiene. That said, a few oddballs often in warmer regions did try to sleep fully clothed, even in their day boots. Why? Superstition. There was a belief in some communities that evil spirits were more likely to attack the vulnerable and exposed. So being half-dressed meant you were less appealing. That's one way to interpret fashion safety. The layering of itchy wool, herb-scented linen, and a general lack of bathing creates an aroma you don't want to imagine too vividly. But somehow, people survive. And they didn't just survive, they dreamed, they loved, they wrote poetry. Even while covered in lice. So tonight, as your clean, breathable sheets swish around your freshly showered body, take a deep breath. It could always be worse. You could be lying on a straw-stuffed sack, scratching at your seams and wondering if that movement under the blanket was your own foot or something else. You shift under the covers, still trying to forget the idea of lice in your seams. But now, imagine yourself in a massive, drafty stone chamber, not exactly cozy, and you're rich. Or at least richer than the average pig farmer. So finally, you can afford a proper bed. Maybe even a servant to pull back the sheets. Which brings us to a question you've probably been asking for a while now. Did anyone back then actually wear something that looked like pajamas? Well, kinda. But before we celebrate too soon, let's be clear. Pajamas in the medieval world didn't mean cute plaid trousers and a button-down top. It didn't mean anything matching. Or even separate. What we now think of as sleepwear didn't really become a thing until centuries later. But for the privileged few nobles, clergy, or the very sick, there were bedclothes. You could call them pajamas if you squint hard enough. These early bedclothes were usually long linen shifts, loose-fitting garments that looked suspiciously like a cross between a dress shirt and a potato sack. Sometimes they were just repurposed undergarments. Other times, they were specifically made for nighttime use. But here's the catch, they weren't worn for comfort. They were for status. If you had enough wealth to own clothes you didn't wear outside, that meant you had enough clothes, period, which was rare. Wearing something to bed wasn't about softness or style. It was a display of your ability to live above subsistence. Your neighbors slept naked or in their crusty day shirts. You had the luxury of owning a garment you wore only for sleep. Imagine the envy. The irony. These garments weren't particularly well made. They were often made from coarse linen or rough cotton when it became available. They weren't dyed, decorated, or tailored. They were simply long, neutral-colored shifts, possibly with a bit of embroidery if you were feeling fancy. Some were even part of funeral dress. That's right, that clothes were sometimes designed to double as burial clothes. So if you died in your sleep, you were already halfway dressed for your dirt nap. Efficiency at its finest. Historians still debate whether these bedclothes were common in middle-class households or only appeared in elite circles. Some argue that regional differences played a big role. Italian merchants in warmer climates might have embraced the linen shift more readily than a farmer in northern England clinging to a wool blanket and a prayer. Let's not forget the church's influence either. While everyday folks had little time for modesty, Christian doctrine often promoted the idea of covering oneself even in sleep, particularly for women. So in monastic settings or devout households, bedclothes served a spiritual purpose. They were meant to keep the body and thus the soul from straying. In fact, some religious leaders wrote specifically about the importance of being properly dressed in bed in case you died in the night and were brought before God. Imagine showing up at the pearly gates in nothing but your birthday suit, utterly scandalous. So, naturally, you should be dressed. Just in case. This gave rise to the idea of night modesty, an early moral cousin of pajama etiquette. If you couldn't afford actual bedclothes, you might sleep in a long shirt, or wrap yourself tightly in a sheet. The goal wasn't comfort. It was dignity. Meanwhile, in noble courts, appearances mattered just as much. Bedchambers doubled as social spaces, really, and it wasn't uncommon for visitors to be received in the bedchamber. That doesn't mean you were lying there under the duvet, but your sleeping space was part of your public image. So having attractive bed linens, embroidered shifts, and maybe even a robe to toss on while greeting your guests was a marker of class. One truly strange detail from courtly life: there are records of men wearing elaborate silk nightgowns over their real clothes, not under. These nightgowns were ceremonial, not functional. Think of them as the medieval version of a smoking jacket crossed with a bathrobe worn during late-night discussions, not actual sleep. In short, they were pajamas in name only. And don't get too excited about those silk fabrics. Silk was wildly expensive, and the rare silk nightrobe would have been starchy, not soft, not breathable, either. More like trying to nap inside a tent. So where does that leave you? Probably still stuck with the itchy wool and coarse linen of the masses. But at least now you know that someone, somewhere, was climbing into bed in a rough-spun smock, whispering a prayer, and hoping the night air didn't carry rats. Oh, and if you were ill, that's one of the rare times when pajamas were strongly recommended. Not for your comfort, mind you, but to protect your caretakers from whatever illness you were oozing. A long shirt served as a kind of cloth barrier, primitive bit, if you will. Tonight, you pull your blanket up just a little tighter. Suddenly your thrift store pajama pants and oversized hoodie feel like the height of fashion. Because in the Middle Ages, the only real luxury wasn't a matching set, it was having anything clean to sleep in at all. You roll over in your hypothetical medieval bed, straw poking your back, one shared blanket tugged in too many directions, and suddenly you hear church bells in the distance. Not exactly your ideal lullaby. But in the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just ringing bells for dramatic effect. It was everywhere, in everything. Including your bedtime routine. Let's be very clear, the church had opinions. About sleep. About clothing. And most definitely about what you wore while sleeping. Or didn't wear. You see, to medieval clergy, nighttime wasn't just for rest. It was a dangerous liminal space between day and night, between waking and dreaming, between virtue and temptation. And your body. Oh, that was a battleground. Which meant how you presented yourself during sleep mattered. Far more than you'd expect. Sleeping Nate. A problem. Especially if you were a woman. Not because of the cold. Not because of lice. But because, according to many religious leaders, it left you vulnerable to sin. Demonic temptation was believed to creep into your dreams like a bad draft through a window. And if your soul was unguarded, so was your modesty. A devil in the night might do more than just mess with your mind. Historians still debate whether this was strictly enforced or more of a preachy ideal. But we do know that some monastic orders required monks to remain fully clothed at all times, even in bed, as a form of discipline. That's right, no wriggling into something looser after Vespers. You were expected to lie down in your scratchy robes, stiff and penitent, just in case you were called to prayer in the middle of the night or dropped dead and needed to look appropriately dressed for the afterlife. One document from a 12th century monastery rulebook states, quite sternly, "Let none sleep unclothed, lest Satan find an opening." Bit on the nose, isn't it? Now, imagine being a teenage novice monk reading that for the first time. Good luck ever sleeping again. And it wasn't just monks. Theist laypeople, those trying to lead morally upright lives, are sometimes encouraged by local priests to wear bedclothes that guarded the flesh. There are scattered references in sermons and devotional texts warning that to sleep naked was to invite vanity, or worse, incite the sin of pride in one's own form. Translation: even if you looked like a medieval heartthrob, modesty was the priority. Sleep shame was real. But here's the curious part: while nudity in bed was discouraged by the church, it was still widely practiced. Why? Because the church wasn't paying your fabric bills. Priests could tell you to wear a long nightshirt to bed, but if you only owned one garment, and it was soaked with sweat and livestock smells, guess what? You were still slipping into bed bare. As the day you were born. That's where penance came in. If you couldn't live piously, you could at least feel guilty about it. A lovely system. Some medieval guides to confession even asked about bedtime modesty. Do you sleep in garments? One 15th century confessor's manual asks. Or do you lie in sloth and shame? Yes, they really use the word sloth. Apparently not wearing a nightgown was on par with being lazy and indulgent. Which, let's face it, is kind of the point of pajamas now. This obsession with nighttime virtue also extended to who you slept near. Unmarried men and women were supposed to keep a fair distance. In many households, this meant sleeping in shifts, or using partitions, or more commonly just pretending not to notice the full-grown adult sharing your sleeping pallet. Because modesty is sometimes more about what's not said than what's worn. And yet, even with all this moral pressure, the idea of sleepwear didn't really catch on. Why? Because modesty clashed with reality. When it's freezing cold, you bundle up in whatever's nearby. When it's sweltering hot, you strip down. When you're exhausted, you don't pause to moralize. You just collapse. Still, the church left its fingerprints on bedtime fashion, particularly in the homes of the wealthy and the devout. They were more likely to adopt lie-in-bed clothes, not just for comfort, but as a symbol of religious discipline. Having a clean, modest garment for sleep became a quiet way of saying, "I'm ready for God, for prayer, for judgment, or all three." There are even records of deathbed scenes where the dying are lovingly wrapped in nightshirts and lie in veils, surrounded by candlelight and whispered prayers. It wasn't just sleepwear. It was a final costume. So tonight, you tuck yourself in, whisper a quick please no nightmares to the universe, and marvel at the idea that someone once thought your pajamas might determine your eternal fate. Also just imagine being judged in the afterlife based on your SpongeBob pajama bottoms. You're still awake, aren't you? Well, let's talk about one of the medieval nightwear staples, the humble nightcap. No, not the cozy beanie you grab from your drawer in winter, but a practical, if slightly odd, head covering that medieval sleepers often donned before hitting the hay. Nightcaps weren't about fashion or selfies. They were about function, mostly warmth and hygiene. Cast your mind back to those drafty, stone-walled rooms with no central heating. Your head was the largest source of heat loss, and your hair, a magnet for lice, fleas, and whatever else the medieval world was hiding. Wearing a cap at night helped keep some warmth in, and those creepy crawlies out of your hair at least slowed them down. These caps were usually simple lion or woolen bonnets, sometimes tied under the chin or left loose. Some were so plain they looked like a sack pulled over your head. Others, for the well-off, had a bit of embroidery or decoration. But no one ever confused a nightcap with a crown. Curiously, nightcaps have an odd place in history because they've survived as a kind of caricature of old-timey sleepwear. You've probably seen cartoons with a character in a long nightshirt and a pointy, floppy nightcap with a pom-pom dangling off the end, ready to yawn theatrically before blowing out a candle. That image has roots in these medieval caps. Historians still argue about how widespread nightcaps actually were. Some say it was mostly in colder northern regions, while others believe the practice was more universal. There's evidence from wills, inventories, and even poetry that nightcaps were a part of many people's bedtime wardrobes, at least among the middle and upper classes. Interestingly, some folk customs gave the nightcap a more mystical role. In parts of Europe, it was believed that wearing a nightcap protected the sleeper from evil spirits or bad dreams. The cap acted like a kind of shield, keeping the soul safe as it drifted off to sleep. You might imagine, then, a room full of medieval sleepers, their heads snug in lion bonnets, dreaming under heavy blankets of straw or wool. A far cry from the modern sleep mask or noise-canceling headphones, but it was their version of sleep protection. Some people even wore shrouds or loose cloths over their heads at night, especially if they were sick or elderly. This was partly to keep warm but also tied into religious ideas about purity and death. It's a bit eerie to think about, but death and sleep were often closely linked in medieval minds. You might be wondering, did everyone wear a nightcap? Not at all. Some just tossed one on when the nights got particularly chilly or when they were about to catch a cold. Others found the caps itchy and annoying and simply went without. One quirky note: some servants were tasked with making sure their masters wore nightcaps. There are accounts of noble ladies being reminded to pull their caps down snugly or risk catching night chills. It was the medieval equivalent of put on a sweater, you'll catch a cold. So next time you slip on your favorite cozy hat or hoodie before bed, remember that the medieval nightcap was the UGG sleep accessory. Sure, it lacked style points, but it served a purpose of keeping you a little warmer and a little safer in a world that was cold, dark, and full of things that went bump in the night. You might even imagine a medieval sleeper giving a little nod to their nightcap before drifting off like a silent pact between body and fabric to survive the long, chilly hours until dawn. You're settling in deeper now, and it's time to talk about something medieval people probably didn't talk about much: cleanliness. Or, to put it gently, the lack of it. Tonight, you breathe in that fresh lion scent from your modern sheets and wonder, what did medieval people smell like when they went to bed? Spoiler alert, not roses. Soap was a luxury, made from animal fats and ashes, and often smelly. Itself, the idea of daily bathing was almost unheard of in much of medieval Europe. People believed that too much washing could open pores and invite disease or even evil spirits into the body. So instead, most folks just avoided bathing. Your one lion shirt, probably as grimy as your phone screen after a day of scrolling. Your blankets, a magnet for sweat, skin flakes, and the local flea population. Historians still debate exactly how often medieval people bathed. Some say once or twice a year was normal, others suggest more frequent washing with cloths or quick dips in cold water. But the general consensus is, medieval hygiene wasn't winning any awards. Some lucky nobles had access to perfumed oils, herbal sachets, or incense. They'd stuff these into pillows or hang them in their bedrooms to mask the smell. There's a record of a 14th century noblewoman who had a special sweet chamber filled with lavender and rosemary to chase away unpleasant odors. But for the average person, you got what you got. And that meant sweat, musk, and the faint but persistent aroma of farm animals, cooking fires, and yes, human bodies living in close quarters. You might shudder, but remember, this was normal. People didn't think of themselves as smelly. They thought of others as smelly. Bathing was communal, public, and sometimes embarrassing. Plus, public bathhouses could be hotbeds of disease or worse, moral scandal. Sleeping next to someone with the scent of unwashed hair and skin was just part of life. It was intimacy and reality rolled into one. Now, imagine trying to sleep in all that. Your clothes, your blankets, your hair all loaded with the day's grime and the neighborhood's invisible guests. Still, some remedies were attempted. Folk medicine offered herbal washes, vinegar rinses, or cleansing steams. Maybe you dipped your feet in rose water or rubbed mint leaves on your face. These were more about ritual and comfort than real hygiene. And here's a fun fringe tidbit. There's evidence that some medieval people believed their smell could protect them from disease. Wearing strong-smelling herbs or even garlic was thought to keep the plague or bad spirits away. So, smelling like a walking garden wasn't just fashionable, it was survival. Sleeping amid all this was less about freshness and more about endurance. You lay in bed, breathing the musk of humanity, the scent of a world without deodorant or fabric softener. Yet despite all this, medieval people found ways to sleep and dream. They adapted to their environment, tolerating smells and itches would find unbearable today. So tonight, as you wrap yourself in your scented sheets and spritz your pillow, think of the medieval sleeper down the hall, grubby, sweaty, maybe a bit itchy, but ready to face another day. At least you don't have to share your bed with the family cat or the fleas. You're getting cozy now, drifting deeper into medieval sleepwear mysteries. Let's unravel a curious thread. When medieval people did wear something to bed, it often wasn't distinct from what they wore during the day. In other words, the line between day clothes and night clothes, practically non-existent. Imagine trying to spot the difference between your worn-out work shirt and your sleep shirt. Spoiler, they were often the same garment. There was no strict pajama set, no designated nighttime wardrobe, no matching slippers. This wasn't laziness, it was economics and practicality. Clothing was expensive and precious. Owning multiple outfits was a luxury few could afford. So people made do by wearing the same linen or woolen shift around the clock, sleep, work, worship, and all. In some records, we see references to shirts or smocks that were layered beneath outer garments, but these underlayers doubled as nightwear. They were loose, simple, and functional. No lace, no frills, just a thin barrier between your skin and the rough world. A curious quirk, some garments were so stained and worn that they were only fit for nighttime use. Maybe a day's worth of sweat and dirt rendered them unacceptable for social settings, but perfectly okay for the privacy of bed. Historians still argue about whether this wear all day, sleep in the same practice was universal or varied by region and class. Some say that even wealthier folks kept separate sleep shifts, but they were basically the same shape and style as day shirts, just cleaner or softer. And cleanliness? Well, clean was relative. Think about this, your medieval counterpart might have worn a lion shirt for days or weeks, sweating and working in it, before tossing it aside to air out, or worse, sleeping in it until it practically grew roots. In literature, characters sometimes complain about their night shifts smelling like a goat or worse. But without washing machines, that was just lie. Another curious fact, sometimes clothes were repaired with patches that might be colorful or embroidered, making a sleep shirt look like a quilted work of art. This wasn't about style, it was about survival and thrift. And here's a fun fringe note. Some peasants used their day shirts as blankets in winter, wrapping themselves tightly and sleeping curled up to conserve warmth. So, if you thought changing into your pajamas was the natural way of bedtime, remember, for centuries, people treated their clothes like a second skin, wearing them long after they'd lost any fresh appeal. In a way, your nightly ritual of peeling off your workday clothes and slipping into fresh baths is a modern luxury. For them, clothes were simply part of life's rough fabric, sometimes literally. Tonight, as you snuggle in your separate, cozy sleepwear, think about that medieval person whose only pajamas were the same lion shirt worn while chasing chickens and hauling wood. No glamour shots, just a simple, scratchy, persistent thread connecting day to night. As you get comfortable, the night stretches long and dark, and with it come worries beyond just bed bugs and scratchy shirts. Imagine wrapping yourself not for warmth or modesty, but as a defense against plagues, curses, and the ever-dreaded fleas. In medieval times, clothing sometimes doubled as armor against the invisible terrors that haunted the night. Yes, people layered up in multiple garments, but not because it was cozy. Often, those layers were meant to protect the body from parasites and supernatural threats alike. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs were a fact of life, breeding in the very fabrics you wore and the straw mattresses you lay upon. Some people believe that layering your clothes or even sleeping fully clothed could keep these pests at bay. There's a curious piece of folklore from England where a family placed clothes and herbs in a circle around their bed to ward off evil spirits and disease. You can almost picture them in their scratchy wool layers, clutching sprigs of rosemary or wormwood as talismans against the unseen. But there's more than just bugs. Medieval Europe was awash with superstitions. Bad dreams were thought to be visitations by demons or witches. Protective layers of clothing and special amulets worn to bed were meant to shield the sleeper's soul. Some believed that the clothes you wore at night could either invite or repel misfortune. So in some households, you might find people sleeping fully clothed, not out of habit, but out of fear. This protective layering extended even to the sick. When plagues swept through towns, people tried everything from burying themselves in layers of lion to avoid contagion, to carrying charms sewn into their garments. Historians still debate whether these practices had any real impact on disease spread, but the symbolic importance was undeniable. Clothing wasn't just practical, it was magical. The result: medieval sleepwear was sometimes less about comfort and more about survival. This is one of the reasons why proper pajamas were slow to appear. For many, nighttime clothes were first and foremost a shield, whether from cold, pests, or evil forces. The irony: the very layers meant to protect you could also harbor the lice and fleas you feared. Those thick wools and layered linens became perfect breeding grounds. So you might find yourself rolling in itchy, layered garments that were both your armor and your enemy. Some noble households went as far as commissioning special plague clothes, garments meant only to be worn in times of disease, washed rarely and disposed of afterward. Not exactly the kind of pajama party you want to attend. And let's not forget the servants, who often wore thin layers underneath to help them stay warm as they tended to their master's needs at night. The medieval night was a complicated affair. Clothing was a barrier, a symbol, and a burden all at once. As you settle down tonight in your own layers, maybe a silk robe, a fleece blanket, you can appreciate that for centuries, clothes were more than just fashion. They were protection. Against cold. Against pestilence. Against unseen terrors. And with that, you can let the scratchy wool and the biting chill fade into the quiet dark. You might think that everyone in the medieval world dealt with bedtime the same way, but no. Gender played a surprising role in how people approached sleeping attire, or lack thereof. Men, women, and servants each had different expectations and customs about what to wear or not wear at night. But here's the catch: for most common folk, those differences were subtle or non-existent, mostly because of necessity. If you had only one shirt, you wore it all day and night, regardless of gender. Still, social norms and modesty laws nudged people in certain directions. For men, especially those of status, nightwear was often simpler: a lion shirt, sometimes a robe thrown over, or nothing at all. They were expected to be robust and hardy, not fussed over with layers or frills. A man might sleep naked or with just his shirt, showing resilience to cold or discomfort. Women's bedtime clothes, on the other hand, were often tied to ideas of virtue and chastity. Sleeping naked as a woman could be seen as scandalous, especially for unmarried ladies. So women, at least those who could afford it, wore night shifts, loose lion dresses that kept their bodies covered even in sleep. In noble households, servants sometimes helped ladies undress, making the night shift an intimate garment that reflected social hierarchies. And don't imagine servants themselves had much privacy or sleepwear. They often shared beds, or slept clothed in the same rough linens they wore for work. Interestingly, there are tales of women wearing multiple layers at night, partly for warmth, partly for modesty, and partly for protection. Some even wore chamisses that doubled as both underwear and nightgowns. Yet, paradoxically, many women also slept naked, especially in rural areas or among lower classes. Again, comfort and practicality often trumped social norms. Historians still debate how strictly gendered these practices were. Some argue that in close-knit families or communal living spaces, modesty rules were relaxed. Others suggest that sleeping arrangements and attire were rigidly enforced in urban or aristocratic settings. Servants in lower classes had little choice. They wore what was available, often sleeping fully clothed out of necessity. Clothing doubled as protection against the cold floors, pests, and surprise intruders. In some monastic orders, men and women alike wore loose, unisex robes to bed, further blurring gender lines in sleepwear. You might also find exceptions in folklore and literature, where gender roles around sleepwear are exaggerated or romanticized, but real life was messier. Imagine a medieval household at night: a noblewoman carefully donning her night shift, a farmer's wife peeling off a soiled tunic to slip into a second-hand shirt, a servant pulling a coarse woolen cloak over threadbare clothes, before lying down on a wooden bench. Gender shaped bedtime customs, but it rarely dictated comfort. Tonight, as you adjust your own pajamas, remember that for centuries, sleepwear was as much about survival and social order as it was about warmth or fashion, and that what you wear to bed says more than you think. Now, you're really feeling the chill creeping in. Winter nights in the medieval world were something else entirely: harsh, bone-numbing, and relentless. There was no central heating, no electric blankets, no heated floors. Just stone walls, drafty windows, and your own ingenuity. So how did medieval sleepers survive the cold months without the luxury of modern sleepwear? They bundled up. But not in the cozy fleece pajamas you're picturing. Instead, they layered thick woolen garments, wrapped themselves in animal skins, and cuddled close to share body heat. Picture a farmhouse bedroom with a large fireplace that's barely enough to chase away the cold. The family huddles together, under heavy wool blankets, or if they're lucky, a feather mattress and a stuffed duvet. Sometimes they'd fill cloth bags with hot stones or embers, known as bed warmers, and tuck them under the covers to add warmth. Imagine trying to sleep with a small, smoldering brick heating your feet. Dangerous and oddly comforting. Nightcaps became essential, too, trapping heat that would otherwise escape through your head. In wealthier homes, heated bricks might be wrapped in linen and passed around at bedtime, or placed inside wooden boxes with perforations to keep the warmth steady. For those less fortunate, several people might share one bed, their collective body heat staving off frostbite. There are records of entire families or groups of servants piled onto one mattress. Historians still argue about how effective these methods were, and whether any medieval family truly stayed warm at night or just survived the cold through sheer stubbornness. And if you were traveling in winter, things got even more brutal. Inns were cold, floors were stone, and shared beds were common. Travelers often kept their outdoor clothes on to sleep, sometimes layering cloaks and heavy boots. There's an old tale of a merchant who, after a night in a freezing inn, declared he'd never again remove his heavy boots before dawn. Winter bedding and sleepwear were also seasonal. Lion nightshirts were replaced with heavier wool, sometimes lined with fur. People even slept with their clothes on top of their blankets as an extra layer, creating a cocoon of warmth. This patchwork of solutions wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was survival. So tonight, as you pull on your soft pajamas and snuggle under your electric blanket, spare a thought for the medieval sleeper shivering through frost and draft, wrapped in scratchy wool and counting the hours until dawn's fire could warm the stone walls again. It's a reminder that for centuries, warmth was a precious commodity, sometimes worth more than gold. You're now traveling with me on a medieval journey, not just through time, but across the creaking wooden floors of an inn, where travelers from all walks of life come together to rest. But in those days, the idea of privacy was flexible at best. When on the road, people didn't have the luxury of their own bedroom or personal bed. Inns, if you could find one, often had large shared rooms where strangers slept side by side on benches, pallets, or shared beds. In these crowded spaces, clothes usually stayed on not because anyone wanted to sleep fully dressed, but because undressing in front of strangers was risky, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright dangerous. Travelers wore their day garments, sometimes layered for warmth, and kept what they could close to their bodies. There are records of people sleeping fully clothed, with boots still on, for convenience and protection. Servants, soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims all mixed together in these spaces, where the line between day and night attire blurred into a practical necessity. Sometimes people carried spare cloaks or blankets to cover themselves, but rarely changed clothes. Changing required a safe place and time, and those were hard to come by. Historians still debate how much of this was modesty, and how much was simple necessity. Shared beds also meant shared germs, pests, and body heat. It's likely you'd wake up sweaty, itchy, or smelling faintly of last night's dinner, sometimes all three. And if you were unlucky, you might have to share a bed with a stranger. Customs varied. In some regions, it was normal. In others, it was a last resort. Travelers often kept their weapons close, just in case. Imagine trying to sleep with chainmail or a sword at your side, fully dressed, in a room filled with snoring strangers. Despite these hardships, inns were social hubs, a place to swap news, share meals, and rest weary bodies. So, your modern hotel room with private bathrooms and climate control. A dream medieval travelers never had. Next time you complain about noisy neighbors in a hotel, remember those medieval inns where strangers piled together for warmth and safety, often awake all night, waiting for dawn. Tonight, as you enjoy your private space, give a thought to the medieval traveler, wary and clothed, sharing body heat and stories in a crowded, chilly room. As you settle back, feeling safe in your own space, think about medieval bedrooms, not just the bed, but the whole room. For most people, a bedroom was a simple space, often just a corner of a larger hall. But for the wealthy, bedrooms were status symbols showing off power, wealth, and taste. A noble's bedchamber was a carefully designed stage. It wasn't just for sleeping, it was for display, receiving visitors, and sometimes even conducting business. The bed itself could be enormous, draped with heavy curtains to keep out drafts and prying eyes. In these rooms, having elaborate bed hangings, embroidered linens, and even specialized sleepwear was a way to assert one's place in the social order. The bedroom became a symbol of refinement, comfort, and distinction. In contrast, peasants and servants slept in whatever corner or bench they could find, often sharing space with animals or other family members. These differences extended to the fabrics, with wealthy bedrooms boasting fine linens and tapestries, while poorer homes used rubber cloth and straw bedding. Historians debate how much these distinctions influenced daily life. Did having a private bedroom change sleeping habits? Did it encourage more modest nightwear? Some suggest yes, while others argue practicality still ruled. Regardless, the bedroom became a private sanctuary for the rich, a far cry from the communal, multi-purpose sleeping areas of common folk. Tonight, as you relax in your own bedroom, consider how this simple space evolved from a basic shelter to a status symbol. You're almost at the dawn of a new era in sleepwear. Slowly, like a sunrise, breaking through a thick medieval fog, fashion started to change. The Renaissance brought new ideas, wealth, and yes, the first glimmers of what we'd recognize as pajamas. By the 16th century, more people had multiple garments, and specialized night clothes began to appear, though still far from the coordinated, cozy sets of today. Nightshirts grew longer, sometimes trimmed with lace or embroidery, and robes meant for bedtime became a thing, though still more for nobles and scholars than peasants. This shift wasn't just about comfort. It was a social statement, a way to signal refinement and status, echoing the broader Renaissance trends of individuality and self-expression. Historians still argue how widespread these changes were. Some see it as a slow trickle-down effect, others as a sharp divide between classes. But the notion that you could own clothes just for sleeping, that idea was planted firmly during this period. Sleepwear evolved from necessity to luxury, from functional to fashionable. So tonight, as you pull on your favorite pajamas, remember you're part of a long tradition and that started with scratchy lion shifts and wild superstition, and blossomed into the comfort and style you enjoy now. And here we are at the final stretch of our medieval bedtime journey. The invention of proper sleepwear as we know it was slow and uneven. It wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that printed cotton fabrics and dedicated pajama sets became more common, thanks largely to trade with Asia and the rise of textile manufacturing. But what does that mean for our medieval ancestors? It means they were missing out on cozy matching sets, soft flannel, and elastic waistbands that make modern sleep a dream. Instead, they settled for what was available: lion shifts, scratchy wool, protective layers, and lots of prayer. The transformation from nothing at all to proper pajamas wasn't just about comfort. It was about changing ideas of privacy, modesty, and the body. The bedroom became more private, clothes more specialized, and sleepwear a new form of self-expression. Historians still debate exactly when and how pajamas became universally accepted nightwear. But the legacy of medieval sleep customs lingers in the occasional cold night, the layering of blankets, and even the stubbornness of your cat who refuses to let you sleep. So as you tuck yourself in tonight, in whatever you choose to wear, remember the long, weird, and fascinating history that got you here. From naked nights and straw-filled beds to printed cotton pajamas, humanity's relationship with sleepwear is a story of survival, belief, status, and eventually, comfort. Sweet dreams, and may your nightwear be ever soft. Now, as the night deepens and your breath slows, feel the weight of centuries fall away. The cold stone walls, the scratchy linens, the whispered prayers, they all fade into a soft darkness. Your body relaxes, wrapped not in coarse wool but in peace. Think of the medieval sleeper, lying beneath heavy blankets in a drafty room, eyes closing despite the discomfort, dreams weaving through a world of mystery and shadow. And you, here and now, wrapped in warmth and quiet, carry that timeless rhythm forward. Let your thoughts drift gently, as soft as the linens you sleep in. The night is long, but rest comes to 11 those without pajamas. So close your eyes, breathe deep, and slip softly into dreams. Good night.